Great then. So, good day everyone. I'm Brian, moderator for this webinar. I welcome everyone for today's webinar, Silica Dust Exposure, Avoidance, and How to Comply with the Revised OSHA Standards. Best Practices, Exposure Control Measures. Please note, you are placed in a listen-only mode for the duration of the webinar. We will have a Q&A session at the end. Also, this webinar will be made available for purchase in form of DVD, e-transcript, and recorded link as the session is being recorded. I would now like to introduce our presenter for today, John J. Meola. John J. Meola, CSP, ARM, is the Safety Director for Pillar Incorporation based in Richmond, Virginia. He is also an instructor at the Virginia Commonwealth University School of Business, Risk Management, and Insurance Department and an OSHA 500 community outreach construction safety trainer. He has authored two safety handbooks and contributes numerous technical safety articles for trade industry publications. Mr. Miola is also an executive officer with the Colonial Virginia chapter of the American Society of Safety Engineers and a past president of this chapter. He works closely with clients from private industry to develop and manage employee safety and health issues across a wide range of businesses. I would now like to hand over the floor to the speaker. Over to you, John.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it very much, Brian. Glad to be here. And I hope everyone um, is ready to roll on this. We are going to cover a lot of relatively technical information. This is, um, this training learning series is aimed at the basic to intermediate level. So we are going to cover a little bit of, material science, basic physics, some chemistry, the OSHA standards, obviously, but it really crosses a lot of food groups. There is no one discrete, compliance activity for silica dust. It covers, touches on several other of the OSHA standards. It's not just a neat one and done type mindset, and it really depends on which industry you represent, which industry you're working in. Brick masons, concrete finishers, um, tile and glass, dental, lapidary stone jewelers are just some examples. But for the purpose today, it'll be a general survey of the major parts of this standard. This is a revised standard. It's important to point out. It's a revised OSHA standard. They've had a silica dust standard on the books for many, many years, as long as the asbestos standard's been out there, probably. So OSHA cannot make a new standard readily. It takes them an average of 5, 7, 8 years to make a new standard from scratch. They can, however, revise an existing standard, and that's exactly what they did. If you recall the Hazard Communication Standard, 1910.1200, which is, that was the kind of the gold standard of all the OSHA data sheets and labels and storage of chemicals. Well, that actually has some bearing on this standard as well. There's pieces of tangential alignment that you need to know both. However, that's an example of OSHA revising an existing standard, which they did in this case. It's 1926 1153, which is the silica dust. It's also under the hazardous materials rubric. In any event, I'm going to run through these slides. If you do have questions, feel free to make some noise, hit the chat button, or ring a bell, do whatever. But there's enough leeway built into the program that I can entertain any questions. We'll get right into the minutia, which is the OSHA standard, the revised standard. It requires right here on the first page written program, a written program that with your company name on it that says how we will control silica dust. And I'll just run through the top 10 so you know what you're looking at here. But a written program is a requirement. Now, that doesn't have to be an encyclopedia. For some companies, maybe a page, a couple of pages, but you need to have a discrete written program for how your company will control silica dust generally. And then you'd have to drop down in the details of the program to what's called work practice controls that will describe, your day-to-day operations, whether it's drilling, cutting, hammering, sweeping, whatever, and discuss those measures in detail. And we'll talk about, the different categories. It's a whole food group and your vital category, critical categories, written program, employee training. Yes, you have to train the employees in how to comply with your written program and exposure avoidance and competent person. These are probably the top three elements. PPE, respiratory controls, ventilation, engineering, administrative, they all have roles to play. A little bit, OSHA makes a big deal in throughout their standard of highlighting the effects of long-term overexposure to silica dust, and it is hazardous. I don't want to say it's deadly, it's not toxic, it's not poisonous. The characteristic of the dust is it's a mechanical irritant, similar, very similar to asbestos. It's a mechanical irritant that gets into the lungs, can penetrate very deep, and the lung has a natural cleaning process that tries to get rid of any contaminants. And people with black lung disease and soot and industrial smog, all of these are problems. So, and that's why you see people like out in the middle of a cornfield next to the coal plant wearing a mask. Well, that's the same protocol as applies in many of these same situations. Mechanical irritants can penetrate into the lungs. Asbestos is notorious, and the lung. And remember, it's not a toxic element. It's not going to poison you. You're not going to get lead poisoning or any systemic failure. It's a mechanical irritant. It causes some organs of the body to react to the irritant. And in this case, the silicosis can impair your function of your lungs. And people get impaired lung function and they can die from it. There's also some evidence that it can affect kidneys and other organs. In any event, we're not here to discuss the health implications. They are legendary. That's described. There's a lot of literature out on the internet that talks about silica. Here's one for you. That link on that page is US Silica. They're a company in New Jersey. They actually make silica sand. It's many industrial uses of silica sand. Well, that's a link to their data sheet, their material safety data sheet. It used to be material MSDS. Now it's just SDS. That link to their safety data sheet describes in pretty extensive detail if you want to know more about it. The next link down I just added this morning. You may not, it's not on the library copy of the program, but that's a link to the CDC, to NIOSH, which is National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. That link takes you to an incredibly informative document. You can Google it and come up with the same type of the same home address to the NIOSH website. It's a free publication. It's probably a dozen pages. Very informative on health effects and preventive measures. I think it's been out there since before OSHA actually revised their standard. So, it may not be up to the minute relate, but the information is very useful. Um, in terms of actual enforcement of the program, I just sent a link out to our clients this morning. OSHA has announced their annual cost of living adjustment to the penalty structure, their fines. They're going from 14,500 up to 15,600. I bumped it up by 1,100 bucks, and that's for your garden variety serious violation, serious, um, citation. Could be fall protection, could be silica, could be there's a company in Virginia, I ain't making this up. Virginia has the dubious distinction, I'm in Richmond, Virginia. Virginia has the dubious distinction of recording one of the highest fines ever for silica rule violation. I think there were a total of three, and they started around 300,000. Or no, I'm sorry, they started around 97,000 for a total of 300,000 for the entire package. They did an inspection out on a bridge job. I'm not going to use any names, but it was a VDOT bridge job that the contractor, and this contractor had a really tight safety program. They were not, in flagrant violation. However, something went wrong during the inspection. There were some words exchanged. It turned ugly. They were cited for three silica violations and I think a couple of other tangential PPE or some other irregularities. But coming to find out, it ended up in one of the greatest high dollar fines in the history of. We're talking, a landmark decision, and they made them pay most of it. They argued and went in and got it reduced. But in other words, so the penalties can be mind boggling, they can be eye popping. So we want to avoid that whole thing. Silica standard is not on the OSHA list of what's called the NEP, National Emphasis Program. It is not on the Mid Atlantic. We're in Virginia, as I mentioned. It's not on the Mid Atlantic list of local emphasis programs. In other words, they're not targeting this. However, it is citable under multi-employer worksite policy by OSHA. That's a whole separate food group of penalty structures and who they can drag to the fire over this. It is applicable under your temporary labor, temporary employee section. They are accountable for compliance. It is accountable under the air monitoring data. It's under the title of exposure analysis, and that may come. Well, that'll come into play a little later in the program. You'll see when you are actually required to do air monitoring and keep a running log on this. It is accountable under what they call Table 1, and that's part of our vocabulary learning for this episode. Table 1, you should remember OSHA Table 1, which is part and parcel of the protective measures and distances and work practice controls associated with the silica standard. Remember that. We're going to reference that in a few minutes. You need to have a competent person, as we mentioned earlier, employee training. And by the way, all of these things is not just to say, well, okay, yeah, let's do that and, one and done. You need to document what you are doing, whether it's a training class or a competent person, not particularly difficult elements. These are not, college level or junior college level. These are, half hour, 2 hour, half day trainings, depending on your level of involvement. It's not rocket science. However, you need to document it, record it, put it in your written plan, date, place, time, signature sheets, the content of the training program. It should all be there, because if OSHA does an audit or you're questioned, well, you got to show this stuff. You got to show proof thereof. And basically, the strategy on an OSHA inspection is basically it's like whack-a-mole. It is very similar to that game. As soon as you think you've done a good job with compliance for all of these, hit factors that you're looking at, whether they're discrete, just like I said, the silica standard touches on like 4 or 5 other related standards: hazard communication, industrial hygiene. You could throw in the COVID thing, depending on which level of denial your company or your state is in. So all of those, the vocabulary, the learning knowledge, the knowledge base for the average safety person or HR intern, or if you're the shop foreman, you're going to go this alone. Well, you have to know at least pay to play. And this page actually illustrates something called the PEL, permissible exposure limit. Now, that's not unique to the silica standard. Many of the contaminants and hazmats and like we mentioned, the data sheets, safety data sheets, they will name a PEL, and it's usually in minute amounts. In this case, the PEL for uh, silica, the revised PEL, is microscopic, submicroscopic. It's on the order of 25 micrograms, which is a millionth of a gram. In other words, we're not talking about much. So here's where I usually say, okay, you can try to exercise your scientific education by measuring microgram exposure, or we can just switch to the overall shotgun approach to say, hey, I don't care what it is, we're going to prevent all of it, which I highly recommend, because if you start using these microgram metrics, I mean, we're talking the weight of an eyelash, the weight of the wing of a fly is another equivalency. So it's submicro, it is infinitesimally. So the metric that we like to apply is to say, if there is a dust producing operation on your job or in your workplace, you need to focus on eliminating it, and not to come back and say, well, it's just the nature of the job. Now, there's a lot of wiggle room that OSHA has built into their program. They recognize they don't want to pick a fight and put anybody out of business, but they recognize to say, well, no, look, if it's just a very short term exposure, that permissible exposure level of 25 and 50 micrograms. 50 micrograms is the overall per cubic meter, is the new overall allowable. Well, 25, once you get to 50% of that, or 25 micrograms, that's called the action level, meaning you got to do something following that threshold. Well, that something can be respirators, it can be air powered purifying respirators, it can be vacuum, it can be water applied to the cutting edge to capture dust, it can be enclosures. There's a long list of things that can happen. My recommendation is, yeah, you can try to split the apple at the 25 microgram level. Trust me, it's really hard at that level. If Here's a recommendation: if you are routinely generating silica dust, small, medium, or large, a little bit, a lot, whatever, if it's a routine part of whatever work you folks are doing, I highly recommend you engage an industrial hygienist and get yourself a set of monitoring data that will definitively establish the levels that you are generating. And hopefully they will be under this 50 microgram threshold, or at the very least under the 25 microgram action level. And you keep that data on hand. You only have to do that test one. And when I say you are unlikely to be the person doing the actual test. It's usually an industrial hygienist. And we've got a slide coming up that details what they do, how they do it. But be prepared. Otherwise, you have to get into all of these air supplied respirators, the cartridge respirators. The OSHA has a respiratory standard that applies if you're going to get into respiratory. Um, you can use voluntary dust masks. They have to be APL, assigned protection factor of 10. They have to be N95. In other words, there's a lot of technical baggage that comes along with it. However, written program, employee training. If you are going to use respirators, close fitting respirators as opposed to the dust mask, then you are in line for employee fit testing and a medical evaluation. I have a client who has to do this every year, send his, because he uses a MSA half mask close fitting respirator with the canisters. He has to send his people for a fit test. And by the way, before they will do a fit test, it's just at the local clinic, they require no facial hair. So you are automatically looking at telling your employee population, hey, Jethro, this is not a beauty contest. You got to shave. And that's going to get some pushback along the way. In any event, which is why I say, cutting this stuff off at the source, meaning do some work practice controls upstream, is the advised method of progress. The other thing you remember we said competent person. Part of your vocabulary, you should know that HEPA, high efficiency particulate assembly that traps microparticles. You got to get rid of the slurry created if you're going to use water. There's some ergonomics that goes with it. The tools that you're going to use, your work practice controls. There's a lot of things that combine, as we say, and we're looking at them. These are actually part and parcel. This is a very simple 6-point summary on your written exposure control plan, your written plan. These are some of the hot buttons that need to be spelled out in the plan very clearly, very succinctly. Identify the tasks that you routinely do that may create a silica dust exposure, and you have to be just very upfront and say, we use angle grinders with a cutting wheel. We purchased a new generation of shrouded tools that have a vacuum attachment. Say it right in. Here's a tip: take a picture of those tools, put them in the written plan. There's nothing that says this has all got to be, sterilized in writing. You can put in pictures, you can put in receipts, you can put in catalogs, brochure from DeWalt or Bosch or Ryobi, whoever made the tool. I guarantee you, in fact, that's probably a good little tip to push forward. Yeah, go to the tool manufacturer's website. Number one, register the tool with the manufacturer. They always have a tool registration program, and that's if there's a recall or an improvement. Mostly, it's for trying to sell you some more stuff. But go to register the tool. If they do improve it or there's a recall, at least you are officially registered at the website. There's a very remote possibility that this could help you in the case of an OSHA or state plan proceeding, to say, it's not just some random thing. Anything, just in a larger, take a satellite view, anything you do in the occupational realm that applies to workers, employees, tools, equipment, PPE, hardware, fire protection, any of that stuff is highly suspect, highly subjected to the being examined in case there's either a general safety inspection, or B, something happens. In which case it could be OSHA making the investigation, but it could also be some personal injury attorney or an insurance company that's asking a lot of details. In other words, you want to be ready to step up and say, hey, wait a minute. Yeah, we bought that tool. Here's date, place, and time. You wrote it on the manual, but you also registered that tool and you were tied into the manufacturer's website. They've got free videos, English and Spanish, bilingual. They've got a lot of technical information. You need to be tied into that. And when I say you, in this case, it could be your competent person who is a requirement under several of the discrete OSHA disciplines. They have a requirement for a competent person. Competent person could be a supervisor. Most likely, it's a working lead person, but someone who has a little bit of authority to recognize. These are key words, by the way, for OSHA. To recognize, write it down so you remember this, to recognize and identify hazards in the workplace. And in the case of the Silica standard, the competent person shall have sufficient knowledge. I'm reading this right out of the OSHA playbook. Shall have sufficient knowledge and familiarity with the task to recognize and identify the presence or likelihood of these hazards being present, and who has authority to take protective measures, including to stop work if necessary to prevent an exposure. And remember, we said on this is the competent person designation. Remember, we said in one of the first couple of slides, we said, what OSHA can use in their accountability process. We mentioned, for example, multi-employer worksite policy. OSHA has a defined multi-employer worksite policy, meaning you might not even be the person creating the dust. You might be working next to that person, some other contractor, drilling or chopping or doing whatever. If your employees are exposed to the dust this other person created, well, that does not absolve you just because you didn't create it. OSHA, the categories in that food group of multi-employer are controlling contractor, creating contractor, correcting contractor, and exposing, meaning your employees. Those are four discrete food groups that you don't want to be one of, because that drags you into to say, well, yeah, you didn't create it, but you didn't do anything to protect your people from exposure. And so the competent person has to know this, because let's face it, you're not going to be on the job with the person. That's just their random thing. Now, it's not a difficult stretch to educate the person, but they've got to be ready to step up. I mean, it could be as simple as making the phone ring, or if they see a cloud of dust, hey guys, come over here, get out of that cloud of dust, don't get exposed, come over here, take some alternate measures to prevent exposures, such as housekeeping, medical exams. We'll talk in a minute. That's if you are in the, remember we said that microgram category, or you are required to wear a respirator for more than 30 days per year, 30 or more days per year. That's when you've got to get your respiratory and health physics all in a row, because then this is all in your written program, remember. This all has to be codified. At that point, you will be maintaining records of worker silica exposure and their medical exams and their micrograms per cubic meter, who took the test, what was the analytic method, and all of this protocol is very easily known. This is not like you've got to go out and invent it. There's a well-established scientific, process for taking asbestos or silica dust standard. Remember, it's an airborne contaminant. There's no chemistry involved. It's basically just collecting the sample on a series of vacuum pumps and filters, and then they weigh the sample. They actually weigh it or they count it. In the asbestos method, they actually count the number of fibers recorded. In the silica, they do it by weight. And remember, we said, who's going to carry around a scale that measures in millionths of a gram? Forgive my, forgive me for chuckling, but it's like, that realm is entirely the realm of industrial hygiene. which is industrial hygienists. These are normally very highly paid scientist people. You rent these guys by the hour, or you find a local consultant and say, look, come out and do my standard silica exposure protocol. And if they say, what is that? Well, hang up and go to the next one, because they should be fully familiar with taking these airborne samples. They put them on the mat. They do a general area sample in the general area to check for randomized dust, but then they put a personal sample on the employee themselves. And they've got a whole process for doing this. They clip the pump. There's a vacuum pump on there, usually on the belt, that sucks through a hose up to a canister in the breathing zone, and that approximates how much this person is going to be exposed to. In any event, this is an important slide. If you're going to stay in the safety business, you need to remember, again, vocabulary is very important here. I guarantee you, if you do get an OSHA proceeding or any type of safety engineering um, intervention, and you start spouting off the OSHA hierarchy of controls, number one, the inspector's going to drop dead in shock that anybody was outside the business was going to talk about the OSHA hierarchy of controls. That is exactly the definition they use. And basically, it just translates into the order of preeminence of the types of controls that OSHA wants to see. Specific to silica, yes, of course. However, the OSHA hierarchy of controls applies across the board to all. Remember, we use the words recognize and identify. Recognize the presence of a hazard and identify this hazard as number one, try to eliminate it, obviously. Well, the methodology to do that is contained in the OSHA hierarchy of controls. It's the order that OSHA wants to see for you doing your job as a good manager, as a good safety leader, to say, oh no, I don't want any exposure of people in my food group, and here's how we're going to do it. And the way you do it is, number one, you look for what's called engineering controls. And an example of an engineering control would be to say, okay, Jethro, don't use that old angle grinder because it doesn't have any dust collection apparatus. Look, I bought you this shiny new DeWalt or Bosch high dollar dust collect tool that does the same thing in terms of its function. However, instead of all the dust blasting all over the place, this tool now has a vacuum hose back to a HEPA vac that sucks all the dust, doesn't let it get airborne. That's an example of an engineering control, meaning the employee doesn't have to do anything special, just use the tool, same as always. However, the tool is set up to, another example would be, say, for a cutting table, you're going to use a masonry cutting, a saw, masonry saw with the sliding table that has a water bath on it, or in the sump of the saw has a vacuum attachment. So as soon as the blade cuts the masonry material, there's dust, it gets sucked down and contained either into a water bath or the vacuum, or there's a hood or there's an enclosure. Another example of engineering methods. And that's what, if OSHA sees that, and you can reference it and say, listen, we went to table one, we looked at our options, and we selected the engineering type of control that would definitively eliminate silica dust in this case. Remember, this applies to any particulate. Same thing. Another example is fall protection by extension. Fall protection, engineering controls is very simple to envision, to say, well, not put a harness on the person. No, no, no. Install some kind of physical barrier, railing, handrail. They give a very precise metric on the height of the rail, the strength of the rail, the mid rail, the toe board. Well, that's an engineering control. Putting a harness on someone for fall arrest or fall restraint, that's a PPE. That's the least desirable method of protection. So engineering is a definitive either tool, parts, hardware, something you can point to. You need to remember this because this is part of your overall, knowledge base, not only for silica, as I mentioned. And, administrative measures are less effective than engineering. However, they are entirely permissible and encouraged by OSHA. If you are doing in our case, silica operation and there is dust, you could limit access to that area. You could post signs and you can make these things up on a computer with a PowerPoint. Doesn't have to be an elaborate posting, but just something that indicates. Remember, we said competent person, recognize and identify. You can identify the presence through posting. That's an administrative measure, less effective than engineering. However, it is preferred over PPE. And I know what you're asking right now, and the answer is yes. You can use a combination of these three factors to achieve the most effective method of hazard avoidance. Hazard of, in our case, again, for silica, yes, you can use PPE. Administrative training is another example of administrative measures, employee training. Competent person is an administrative functional element. And PPE is the last of the hierarchy of controls. The hierarchy is not a college course in physics. It's engineering, administrative, PPE. That's it. That is the hierarchy. They're going from the lowest, least effective at PPE. Administrative is kind of a middle ground, and obviously engineering. Now, if you're smart, you'll write up what's called a job hazard analysis. I'm going to imply that everybody in this room is, you're in it for the long haul. If you really want to learn the methodology, you get used to doing something called a JHA, a job hazard analysis. If you're going to do any US government work, it's going to be called an activity hazard analysis, AHA. And there's a bunch of other names for it. Task hazard analysis, job safety analysis. But the intent is relatively the same no matter what you want to call it. You're going to break this job down. I don't care what you're doing, putting on a new roof, tile work, metal work, hot work, mechanics, you name it. The job hazard analysis is a very controlled, measured procedural step. It's on paper, and there's forms out there. In fact, the best one that I've seen is contained in something called the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers EM 385 Safety and Health Manual. It's called the EM 385, and it's a free download. You can Google it. In that manual, because they require contractors to come in and produce an AHA. And in that book, there's a section that tells you how to do it. And I highly recommend you use it. But in any event, get in the process of doing the AHA or JHA for any of your discrete, in this case, silica generating activities. And it spells out right in the JHA to say we will use the OSHA hierarchy of controls in the following iterations. We have purchased high efficiency vacuum HEPA filters. We purchased N95 respirators. They are spelled out as your hierarchy of controls. And if you get to the PPE level, there should be a training element associated with each of these. And when I say training, I don't mean you got to hire a community college professor to come in. These can be done in a safety meeting, in a tailgate session. Just keep a copy, take a picture. But this is a 3M multimedia interactive slideshow on disposable dust. Put that on your training roster. In any event, the compliance date, OSHA loves to see, their dates involved. Basic industrial hygiene, we mentioned. This again is adjunctive. Remember, we said there's a lot of elements that combine to make this standard work. Well, this is like a basic, in fact, it is one of the most basic of the learning points in the industrial hygiene empire. Remember, we talked, these people are very highly credentialed and cost a lot of money to rent them, et cetera, et cetera. And there's always some, part-time consultant that's doing this stuff. You don't need a degree in rocket science to take the samples. We're talking about the air samples. Remember that 25 micron action level. You got to know what you're doing, but you don't need to be. I mean, if you want to really try to go it alone, which I do not recommend, you can rent the hardware. Find a lab supply joint that will rent you the hardware, and but you got to know what you're doing, and which is why I don't particularly recommend pay the money, get the testing done by a certifiable source. If they start hitting you with a million questions, just go to the next one. I mean, these guys are usually commercial market, but the this is an important learning metric for anybody in the safety business. The whole concept of industrial hygiene is to protect the worker from some external component and contaminant. In this case, it's silica. Well, the only way that these, or the primary, what they call routes of exposure of whatever this substance is, could be asbestos, could be lead, could be poison, could be, sand, whatever, is it's going to get in the body one of three ways, primarily. And those three ways are: you can inhale it, breathe it in, you can absorb it through your skin. Some chemicals are transdermal, they will actually go through your skin, or you're going to eat it, ingest it, okay, and or combinations thereof. If you got a guy coming out of a coal mine, he's covered with black lung, with dust and soot, he's probably doing all three of these. And ironically, that person is listed under the OSHA metric, or I'm sorry, the MSHA, mine safety and health, as opposed to, um, in any event. So these three are the three gold standards for any person in the safety and health business to try to think. I mean, what was the COVID? Look, I remember just a few short months ago. What was the COVID route of exposure? Does anyone want to take a guess? I mean, obviously it was inhalation. So, and then all that stuff about hand washing and sanitation. Yeah, I get it. I mean, there was some version of that, but you weren't going to get it through, touching a doorknob. If that was an exposure, I mean, it was very transient. But inhalation is obviously the route of exposure for silica. So what we want to do is to defend that route of exposure. Number one is to not produce the dust through engineering means, to protect the breathing zone through either PPE. You see, we're right back to the hierarchy of exposure. So that's how this stuff works. And if you are going to engineer yourself your own silica control plan, well, you need to know that stuff, and you need to follow it and do it and practice. And in any event, I'm going to give you a couple of bonus tips along the way here. And these are repeated actually a little further down. In your written program, you will automatically receive bonus points for embodying some form, shape, or form of leadership, company safety policy implementation, and leadership. That the inspector will highlight it with a sharpie, because nobody ever does it, and they have come to realize over the years that the absence of leadership in safety programs is one of the greatest means to assure that your program is in wallpaper only. It's never going to really translate onto the job site. So the word leadership, try to emulate it, put it in your plan. If you're in an OSHA state, which is about half the states, or you're in what's called a state plan state, meaning your state has elected to run with it on its own, the safety and health for occupational, you need to at least know the difference, and that's a simple mouse click over to the OSHA website, which is, by the way, OSHA.gov. It's not terribly complex, OSHA.gov, and you go to their website and you can surf around and educate yourself. In any event, the reference to the OSHA standard and Table 1 should be in your, either reprint them or encapsulate them or put a link. They should be in your written program. Here's a tip for your competent person training. Issue that person a wallet card. Give them a separate, and the competent person, by the way, it's important to remember, is not generic. It's not you've got one competent person for everything you're going to do. It doesn't work that way. The competency of that individual is very specific. It's discipline specific. In this case, obviously, our topic today is silica dust. There is a competent person requirement for any silica dust exposure. Hopefully it can be contained, but that competent person, you give them a wallet card. The ones that I issue are specific to, in this case, silica. And just for illustration, there's a competent person requirement for fall protection. Anytime you have a fall protection exposure, there's a competent person required. Competent person required for trench and excavation that does the analytic for trench and excavation. Scaffolding, staging and scaffolding requires competent person. Anyway, there's a couple of others. In any event, when you do the qualification for that person, always give them, could be a certificate, a piece of paper. We issue a wallet card, put a copy of the training in their folder or HR file to document that we did it. This is part of what's called a continuous improvement strategy, which I highly implore, highly recommend you get familiar with. There's two of the top three buzzwords on this slide: leadership and continuous improvement. I strongly encourage you to explore both of those as a means of enhancing your safety program. Hopefully, you have one that additional elements in the written program. These could be just two paragraphs, two sentence paragraphs. They could be a picture. They could be a whole chapter. It depends how intensive your exposure is. It depends how much time your intern or how much time you want to devote to writing. And it is a written program. It implies, I mean, I guess you could copy some of it out of a book. We don't recommend that. We recommend something custom application to your company and your function. You could embellish it. If you got a marketing department, run it by them. They may have a little more facility with the written word and structuring a nice manual or pamphlet. But it's really dependent on how much you do day in and day out. If it's a daily work exposure, I would have, a 30 or 40 page manual, and this is a pretty good section in it. Most of the ones I write for contractors, 2 or 3 pages with some pictures, with some references to manufacturers' websites, tools and appliance, describe work practices, describe all of your PPE in micro detail, use pictures as we mentioned. Um, there is no prohibition from linking the safety portion to your quality control. In other words, if Jethro is going to drill that hole in that overhead ceiling, you don't want dust, but you also want that hole to be drilled properly, not on an angle. It's going to hold a sprinkler fitting or whatever. Well, the fact of the matter is, there's nothing that stops you from combining to make it, one fell swoop to say, hey, we're all about customer satisfaction, quality control, safety, yada yada, whatever you choose. But there's no prohibition against doing that. The OSHA General Duty Clause. This is part of your overall safety knowledge library. The OSHA General Duty Clause is a catch-all phrase that says, you should reference this in your written plan. It says very succinctly that the employer, probably you for dialing in today, is responsible to provide a workplace free from recognized hazards. And that is the exact verbiage from the OSHA playbook, that meaning that if OSHA cannot find some discrete standard that you violated, they will propose a penalty for under the general duty clause, meaning, hey, we may not have a specific standard, but somebody got hurt or you did something wrong, or we don't like the way you're doing this, they're going to cite you under the general duty clause. Well, it's very helpful if you can actually put that in your overall safety manual and in your written program for Silica and whatever else, and say our intent here is to provide a workplace free from recognized hazards. And the average person would say, okay, well, that's fine for you to say. How are you going to do that? And you're going to say, well, we're going to use the OSHA hierarchy of controls. Does that sound familiar? We're going to apply engineering. We're going to do PPE. We're going to do employee training. We're going to post our workplace. These are all functional elements that qualify. It may sound like corporate wallpaper. Trust me, if push comes to shove, you are going to wish the cows come home that you're going to have these elements that you can point to substantiate, hey, we did all these things. We did all this stuff in order to protect and defend and avoid exposures. And trust me, this happens every day. I'm involved in a proceeding right now where we're kind of scrambling to find to substantiate these identical topics. So um, drilling down to the minutia of this topic, it's why you signed up today. There are two main methods of controlling the dust. One is to use a wet cutting option, meaning this water is going to be drenched on the tool to contain the dust. And number two, vacuum or ventilation, air entrainment. And that's becoming a very much more prominent and more efficient method because you're not making a mess with all this water. You're not making slurry, which is a big problem because slurry is expensive or slippery. It's you got to clean it up. It makes a mess. It leaves residue. If it dries, it turns to dust. So getting rid of the stuff at the point of operation is what OSHA would love to see. Now you can contain it, enclosures, downdraft, hoods, shrouds, all of that is fine. Temporary enclosures, such as they do with asbestos remediation, they build an enclosure out of plastic film, tape the seams, all of which is completely, depending on the level of intensity. Here's a recommendation for you: look for ways to minimize the actual creation of the silica dust. Can we substitute materials? Can we use different means or methods, i.e., if you're going to be drilling into masonry to put a dowel or an anchor, well, do they make this stuff pre-formed or prefabricated? In other words, can you spend an extra few bucks upstream and avoid the whole process of you having to create silica on the job? Most people will say, well, yeah, no, it's going to cost a little more. Okay, here's my advice: adopt it on a limited trial basis. Remember that word about continuous improvement? That's a direct application. You try it out, you do a test, you do your own research on it. Now, if it's an incidental thing for your company and you're only going to do this very minimally, okay, you got some decisions to make. What we're here to tell you is that the two main engineering food groups that you should be looking at to take advantage is, number one, eliminate it entirely. Find a different way of attaching or drilling or modifying. I mean, there's thousands of iterations of how to do this. if you reduce to say, no, well, at the end of the day, we have to do it. Okay, we're going to use engineering means. We're either going to capture with water or we're going to use vacuum or air entrainment, some other method. Everything else, go for it. Try whatever. Remote drilling robots, drones, restricted access, staying upwind of a point of operation cutting area, staying upwind so you're not in the air entrainment. That's an administrative control. Signage, as we mentioned, now, if you're doing sandblasting or actual large scale production, your safety person is going to be very intimately familiar with all of these and more. But again, the vocabulary and definitions. These are some of the minefields in the silica business. Dry sweeping of uh, any iteration. Try to avoid dry sweeping by hand or, I mean, even mechanical power brooms. I can tell you the guys who really do have a big issue is the street sweeping industry. I've done a little bit of consulting for those folks. They really do have an uphill battle. Think about it. That's all they do to get this giant broom, mechanical broom. Now they're sitting in a controlled environment in a cab, positive pressure, and we've done a lot of the testing on their exposure, and it's minimal because they're in a positive pressure cab. But look at the dust they're creating. That is a alternate reality type exposure. In any event, using those giant blowers like they use for shepherding leaves, landscapers using clear no in terms of creating big clouds of dust. And they say, well, all right, well, we're going to use the dust we're going to use the blowers to round up leaves. Well, what about all this other stuff? Well, depending on how often and how and where and what for, you may be subject to the exposure standard for that microgram, 50 micrograms versus 25 at the action level. You may be needing to show a proof that hey, no, look, we tested it, and there's no representative job functions. You don't have to test all day every day. You only do it once, twice. First shift, second shift. You do it for the employee, whoever's going to be on the crew, but you want to be able to show, look, we tested this. The exposure is so diluted or diverse, or it's just leaves. It's not silica dust. In any event, you need to document that so you're not be able. People can say, oh, look, this guy's breathing dust. Um, they had one. There's one community here in Virginia that they actually outlawed the use of leaf blower. I ain't making this up. They outlawed the use of gasoline powered leaf blowers, gasoline powered, because of the noise and the pollution and the carbon footprint. I ain't making this up. Bethesda or Chevy Chase, it's actually Washington, D.C., they outlawed the use of gas powered, gasoline powered leaf blowers, mostly because of the noise. They made them switch to electric. But they didn't throw these guys under the bus randomly. They actually set up some kind of a program to help the people make the transition over to the battery powered tools, and they are available. Steel and Hilti, I think they make a battery powered blower, much quieter, less vibration, doesn't have the air emission, it's electric, so the carbon footprint thing kicks in. In any event, so never think that you're up against this alone. The industry is trying to do their part. Another industrial hygiene check, we said the no-nos, never, and I can emphatically underscore, never allow eating, drinking, smoking, etc. anywhere there's going to be a dust exposure, or for that matter, any contaminant exposure. It's just not good practice to eat or drink on the job, or smoke for that matter, although, that's going the way of the dinosaur on its own. But make sure it does not happen. If OSHA sees that, that could result in an increase in your penalty. And again, we said multi-employer worksite policy, meaning your guys are having lunch sitting in the shade. Some morons make it a big cloud of dust. It blows on your guys. OSHA could be all over that in that situation. So you don't want to let that happen. So part of your competent person education standard. And by the way, you're going to translate all this into Spanish, right? This is all going to be bilingual for the person to be out on the job to actually get it. But these are real facts. I mean, don't think that any of these are hyperbolic, long range. These things happen every day. If a good inspector gets out there, they're going to look for certain elements. And if they get the wrong answer or the wrong feedback on a question, that's when things can turn ugly real fast. So protect yourself, protect your company. Here's a slide on the tooling. Again, this is under the engineering category, so it's in the preferred range of the OSHA food group hierarchy of controls. Here's a couple of tips. Now you can go down to the hardware store and buy the top of the line Hilti, Bosch, DeWalt, you name it. Save the literature. Most people tear open the box, put the tool, plug it in, put the battery, do whatever, go to work. Trust me, you need to save the instructions, the manufacturer's manual. And you can do that if you're using the tool at home in your backyard, in your basement, helping your neighbor. But if it's an occupational setting, you need to have all these ducks in a row because that tool is now part of that worker's exposure inventory, especially if you bought the tool that's got the air. This illustration is of a jackhammer with a water nozzle on it. There's the air line and the water line. I actually have a contractor who bought this identical assembly. They had to get it from two different people, ironically. In any event, they use it because they do a lot of jackhammering on masonry, and it does make dust. Well, they went and bought the water. The other guy's using a vacuum nozzle on looks like a Hilti. That's their trademark red, either Hilti or Milwaukee. But he's drilling. You see the hole. You don't even see it. It's completely covered, completely encased by the shroud vacuum, so that's getting sucked right back. Now he's wearing a dust mask, just as an added benefit, which is entirely fine. There's no prohibition. Remember one thing about the OSHA standards, real simple. You can do exactly what the standard requires, but not less. Okay, and obviously intuitively you say, well, okay, I know, you have the 42-inch handrail. However, you can also do more than the standard requires. And that's a bonus round. That's your bonus. You want to be in that category. Because if there is some type of a proceeding, you'll get credit for at least doing the minimum, but they'll put a note saying, oh, by the way, employer chose to go beyond the OSHA requirement, and that's the category you want to be in. In any event, on these tools, keep the instructions. I mean, now they put a CD. If you go to their website, they've got a YouTube video recorded, all of which you want to have as part of your training library. Reference it. It should be, repeatable, obviously, because if you hire a new person tomorrow, they're going to have to follow the same protocol. All of these are highly recommended under the documentation plan. This is all in your written program again. Employee training on the proper use of the tool. And if that training is there, then use the manual as your training document. I can tell you the tool I see most often, it's one of the ugliest and most problematic, is the cutoff saw. Steel, and a lot of companies make them using any type of a rotary cutoff saw with the masonry blade. Yes, it will work. It's done every day, all day. pavement maintenance guys, asphalt, concrete, pipeline crews. Very popular tool, very versatile. It usually comes with a water dispensing mechanism. Here's the point I need you to remember. If that tool was purchased out of the box with whatever type of attachment, our responsibility as employers to maintain that tool just the way we got it is a requirement under OSHA. They call that conforming with the manufacturer's recommendations, whether it's for the operation and use of the tool, the maintenance, cleaning, repair is all must be done in accordance with the manufacturers. In other words, you can't say, well, no, I bought it, I can do anything I want with it. Well, OSHA doesn't quite see it that way. They want to see, for example, if you break the guard, it does not mean, well, throw it away, don't worry, we don't need it. No, 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 no. If that guard needs to be on there the same as the day it was born, or OSHA will cite you for failure to maintain in manufacturer's recommended condition. That applies for manuals, it applies for the training, it applies for the attachments, it applies for modifications. Taking a guard off a tool is not good business. That is not good safety practice. Taking it off for a discrete reason, yes, you can do it. However, it should be limited. It should not be tool should never be stored with no guard because it's evidence that, hey, somebody took it off and was too lazy to put it back. Therefore, the guard's going to get lost. Keep that guard on the tool in any shape or form, let alone for the silica. But do your research. But tooling, very helpful in terms of avoiding the exposure by engineering means. A little bit on the competent person. This is usually a supervisor or working crew leader. They've got to be at least minimally familiar with the standard itself, in this case, the silica standard, which is not rocket science. There's more verbiage in this standard that concerns remember we said all that scientific stuff about the testing and the micro whatever grams. There's more, and the keeping the records of all this testing. There's a lot, health maintenance, health records maintenance. OSHA, they go off the deep end. I have to admit it, but there's a lot of language on that stuff. Well, the competent person does not specifically need to know all that. They need to know it's there, but not in the minutia of technical jargon. They just need to know, hey, we're gonna avoid making dust by doing the following things. And if my guys see dust, they're gonna call me. He just needs to be the upfront person that's going to control and avoid and get the job done and not have headaches. So you got to pick the right person. They have a good rapport with other employees. They've got a little bit of a thinking cap on. They can figure out problem solving. Bilingual if you have Spanish or Hispanic, which is very common in the trades. All of our training is done in bilingual. That's an OSHA requirement. You can't stand there and speak English to a room full of folks that doesn't have a clue. If you can't do it or you don't have a translation person available, do not give up hope. Go to YouTube, Google your topic, put in the word Espanol. I guarantee you somebody has had this issue before. There's going to be a variety to choose from. There's some better than others. It helps to know what you're looking at. But in any event, it's like don't give up hope. The OSHA website, most of the OSHA programs are bilingual now. They're actually expanding their library to other languages. However, it's all free. They're all available. There are several in-kind organizations, Center to Protect Workers' Rights, CPWR, AGC, ABC, any of the big associations. But competent person, in other words, should have some skin in the game. They should know the standard, know who was OSHA, know the protocols. Now, when I say know it, they don't have to be, college level expert on it. Just, get the point across. We typically will equip this person, like I say, we'll give them a wallet card. Well, the wallet card, name, date, time, training, well, on the other side of the card is the top 10 list for the whatever the subject matter. Trench and excavation, soils analysis, trench box, limited distances, 5 feet, and we put it right on the card. Same thing with this. Fall protection is another example. You could do periodic refresher training, highly recommended. Documented all of this, by the way. Periodic refresher training does not need to be in a classroom. It could be a tailgate meeting, could be on the job training. There's nothing that says OSHA just wants to see that word get out there. By the way, and there's a slide on this a little later. I might as well throw it out now. OSHA is part of the U.S. Department of Labor. OSHA is one of like 6 different agencies in the Department of Labor. Well, that L word should inform your judgment right there. Labor means people, not generic, roboticized labor. So OSHA is all about educating, training, protecting the people, your employees. So anything that you can do to demonstrate that you actually lifted a finger, you actually went above and beyond, you did something, call it training, education, improvement, take your pick. How you can achieve that is multi-platform. Now easier than ever with all the digital media. In any event, that's what OSHA wants to see, that you have educated and trained. That's a key word, training. And it doesn't take, like I say, a college level exercise to do it. This is another, actually, this slide is a category of nice to know, but you're probably never going to reach this level. This is the one that actually talks about how much micrograms can be exposed. Remember, we said 50 was the max, 25 is the action level. Well, trust me, you don't want to be in that. I mean, who's going to come in and say, "Well, no, you had 150." Well, it's like, wait a minute. No, I don't want any. I want to engineer this thing right out. And there are ways to do it. But if you are in the measurement category, your guy, your competent person should at least know that these metrics are out there. Hopefully, you're never going to get bogged down in the minutia of doing them, but they are out there. Training the employee is part of this. Now, the average employee does not need to know, the minutia on the testing and the distinctions associated. That's way out of their knowledge base. What they do need to know is, if you see a cloud of dust, number one, don't be anywhere near it. Notify your boss. Wear this dust mask respirator. If they have to be qualified with the uh, fit test, that's all part of their metric. How to put new filters on a respirator. What are the engineering, administrative, and PPE controls that your company is going to adopt? Those are all training points. Um, Obviously, if it's a dust mask respirator situation, they need to know chapter and verse, all of which is on the box when you open the respirators. It's going to be all written out right for you. I guarantee you, if you buy a reputable brand of hardware, whether it's PPE, industrial hygiene, whatever, the manufacturer is going to have enough information in the box to educate you, and they're going to go to refer you to their website where you could probably find something useful in terms of the actual. Are there any questions at this point? Is everybody still on board with us here? Let's go take a quick look and see if Any questions that you want to pony up to make it more applicable to your industry? But in any event, these we're going to, resume our program here. Um, Alternative measures. One thing before we move off this slide, if you do choose to use what's called alternative exposure controls, you need to get out your pen. You need to document these. It's meaning, hey, we weren't smart enough to find a engineering control. We weren't smart enough to figure out an administrative control, but we're going to invent our own. And that's maybe you're going to build an enclosure, you're going to stay upwind, you're going to do whatever. These are, and it's permissible to do this. Remember, we said table one, if you do not choose to stay within the recommended practices on table one, that means you're going to flip over and say, hey, we're smart enough to run with this on our own. We think we can do it, and you're entirely permitted to do that. There's no hesitation. However, you need to be really good at what you're doing. You need to document this stuff, write it up in a procedural, it's got to be in your written manual to say why, number one, why you cannot use the dust control methods specified in table one, and how your methods are going to be equal to or better those table one. And I can tell you, I would be hesitant to go to that level. You got to know what you do and have your ducks in a row in order to step up on that. This is a screenshot of a table one. That's actually the link to table one. It's real simple. OSHA.gov/silica/table one, and it's 1926, which is the construction industry standard. Slam dunk. It's out there. It's free. It's probably a 20-page document, line item. Go through it with a highlighter. Pick and choose what applies, what looks familiar, what you may learn some good ideas. But it takes a little hard. It takes a little reading to get used to their nomenclature, the graphics of the table, but they pretty much give you the first. When I first read it, we were rolling our eyes, saying, "Holy crap! Imagine what they're going to ask for." Now, the first few categories were all, well, what do I have to do if I use this saw with water in an outdoor area? It says nothing. You don't have to do anything. No respirator, no additional measures, no whatever. Well, I'm sorry. I mean that, none, none, none. And it is true, because if you do one of these operations for a limited time on a limited basis, you don't have to take any additional measures. However,
John,
yes, sir.
John, sir, your PPT is not showing on the full screen. It would
I'm
be
sorry.
better if,
Oh, I'm sorry. Right here.
yeah,
Better?
now, yeah, better. Sorry for the
Okay.
interruption.
Yeah, I'm sorry. In any event, the category of none, none, none does not mean you get a free pass. You don't have to do anything. My recommendation is minimum is to have some form of dust control present. Water, vacuum, dust mask are among the most. Eye protection anytime there's a tool involved. The guy in this picture is automatically in violation. In two counts. Number one, no gloves. Number two, you see the guy standing next to him with that wand? This is a very key point. You need to pay attention to this. Remember, we said, in conformance with the manufacturer's recommendations, that if that tool was designed with that water dispensing nozzle, of which it's on there, you can see it, that hose facing us, that's the original manufacturer's piece. The guy standing next to him with that other hose, that can technically possibly get you in trouble, because that is not a manufacturer's provided instrument. That's just some pump sprayer the guy bought at the tool store, and he said, "Oh, well, we'll dump some more water on it." Yes, you can. However, that primary manufacturer's nozzle needs to be on the tool and functioning. In other words, you can't just randomly say, well, I'm doing the same thing. I'm pouring water on it just like the guy's nozzle, but mine broke there. And I actually had this happen. The first generation of the steel chop saw water dispensing system was a piece of crap. It was a flimsy piece of plastic, and it broke. And my guy did exactly what you see here. He went and bought a pump sprayer, and he was spraying the heck out of these. He got caught on an inspection. Now they gave him a pass because he was not making dust, but they told him point blank, you cannot take it upon yourself to be as smart as the tool guy and start spraying water. That doesn't work. So he actually had to go back. And when he did go back to buy the new hardware, Steel had gone to the second generation of this stuff, and they were making all these fittings out of kryptonite. God's honest truth, they were making them very hard, uh, um, some kind of phenolic plastic that was unbreakable, could take the gaff, take the heat, wouldn't break, last a long time. Perfect. And that's where you need to be. But a simple thing like that. Now, hey, you guys signed up for the webinar, so you need to know this stuff. These are where people can run off the rails. OSHA has a name for this. Remember, we said terminology is important. OSHA has a name for all this rigmarole about staying within the manufacturer's recommendations. It's called adoption by consensus. That is the exact terminology. In other words, OSHA is not going to write a regulation for every tool, hardware, drill, or saw that's out there. What they do is they adopt the manufacturer's manual by consensus, meaning if you don't follow what is said in this manual, you're in violation of our standard. Yeah, it is that. It sounds rather draconian. Now, they only going to use that when they can't find some other random stuff to cite you for, but trust me, stay within. And here's a bonus tip for you. And that saw is a notorious example. If you look closely at the saw or drill or vacuum, it's just like a ladder. There's decals all over this thing. Some of them are pictorial, some of them are written, spelled out. You need to make sure that those decals, particularly if they're safety warning decals, those decals have to remain legible and functionable, and they can't be covered up with brick dust or whatever, or you're liable for a citation. Again, part of the consensus standard under the manual, under the requirements of OSHA. So it's not just the dust control system itself. It could be labels, it could be warnings. I had one of my roofer clients get cited because he spilled liquid tar, all over the side rails of some of his brand new aluminum ladders. I ain't making this up. They cited him for it. Now, they didn't give him much of a penalty, but he went to the manufacturer, Louisville Ladders website, and you can buy for $8 a new set of decals. They'll mail them to you, and they're adhesive decals, the original, and that's a requirement. So let that be a lesson. Any type of hardware, tooling, PPE, always save the bag, the box, the manual, etc. Anything. It's just proof of you doing a good job. One thing to bear in mind, any cloud of dust, whether it's silica or smoke or burning oil or tie or whatever, is a magnet for an inspection. It's a magnet for somebody to call a phone 800 line, all of which I've had happen. So make sure your program is tight. Okay, we're going to move into, there's a mix of the next few slides that is good recommended practice and OSHA requirement. And I'm not going to differentiate, hoping that you'll at least know if you are on a specific job site, uh, for any length of time, we always recommend job hazard analysis. specify what you're going to do, what are the materials, specify that you've gone Googled up your safety data sheet for that material, specify if you're going to use any of your control measures, whether it's vacuum or water or containment or shrouds. Specify all of this on your job hazard analysis. Trust me, if you are audited, if you're going to go to work for any military, they're going to ask for this in advance, the AHA, and it better be right or they'll reject it. And they don't tell you why they reject it. You got to figure that out on your own. But trust me, you want this document on the crew truck in your supervisor's inventory and review it with the crew. Do a little safety meeting. You get extra bonus points for having the JHA. This takes you to the actual protocol for respiratory protection. If you cannot reduce the dust exposure to an acceptable level, remember we said hierarchy of controls. If you can't remove the dust, then you are stuck with inventing your own version of exposure control. These are called the alternate. Remember table one, you blew through table one. Using any other type of respirator other than a dust mask requires a full respiratory program, meaning no facial hair, you have a pulmonary function exam, you have to have medical records on each person, they have to go for an exam annually. So it's a lot of baggage. That's why we recommend, do your homework up front. Now, all is not lost. This is a relatively the whole tool manufacturing empire, of which you're talking some huge multinational corporations. These guys are doing their homework. I challenge you to find some job or process that has not been sufficiently engineered to get this stuff out of your hair. I guarantee you, someone has gone before that has done a pretty good job, whether they did it for OSHA or self-aggrandizement or whatever, or maybe they're patenting it. But if they do your homework, there are usually ways you can beat the rap on this exposure. This is an example of alternative measures. Chest X-rays may be required. Um, Available technology, measure your exposure, again, industrial hygiene, vacuum pumps. We covered some of this. I'm going to move on. If there's any questions, let me know. We can come back to it. These are just a selection of the technical guides and references, all free, all from OSHA. If your food group fits any one of these, download the booklet, print it, have it on file, use it as a training method. These are all, here's that CPWR, Center for Construction Research and Training, working safely with, I mean, there's a ton of research material out there, so you should never be at a loss for educating yourself, doing a little self. These are links to each of these websites. Granger actually does a phenomenal job how to comply with the new OSHA Silica rule. Very good tutorial. Any of your tool manufacturers, I mean, think about it. They've got skin in the game. These guys are here for the long haul. They want to not only sell the tool, they want to support, customer support to go along with it. This applies not only to the PPE for silica, any safety hardware. A lot of cheapskate superintendents, they Google whatever they want to buy. They usually look for the cheapest stuff out there. Bad practice. Depending how much you use, depending what you're doing with it, buying the cheap stuff is usually a recipe for disaster. It may cover you with the standard, but in the long run, it's a fool's mission, fool's errand. It's not the cheapest stuff. It's cheap because it's cheap, meaning it's not going to last. It's going to be harder to use. It won't do the effectiveness, the same job. So if you're going to be in this business for the long term, you got to buy stuff that's robustly built, engineered, some features on it. Yeah, I mean, examples, high efficiency filters. You can buy the regular Craftsman shop vac filter that's 85% as efficient as the HEPA filter. However, if you read into the minutia of the requirement for the HEPA filters, has to have a pulse, and either have to maintain the filters by changing them, checking them regularly, or it's got to have a back pump pulse. It's a lot of baggage. Meaning, can I get out of this thing? Yeah, you can if you figure out a better way to get rid of the silica in the first place. So, like everything has a food group and a iterative chain of requirements that follow it to the grave, literally. Um, Self-cleaning filters, that air pulse is written in the standard. There is, in fact, a whole group of people out there that's all they do. They figure out ways to contain, eliminate, minimize, mitigate. um, if you're doing this incidentally, but one question that does come up very often is, what do I do with the slurry that's generated from a water cutting process? And if you're cutting a sidewalk or a driveway, there can be an appreciable amount. Well, number one, if there's enough to actually physically clean up, whether we vacuum it or sweep it or shovel it, you just contain it and it can be disposed of the same as any earth mineral material, meaning you can dump it in a garbage landfill. The only problem with it is it's incredibly heavy. A 5 gallon bucket full of dirt is close to like 86 pounds. Plus, it's wet. So, number one, and it's slippery. So, that's like an incidental, but it can go into it's landfill acceptable. There's no special, it's not like you created some kind of a toxic, byproduct. Surfactant means you dumped a little bit of, you put a few drops of Dawn dishwashing detergent into your water tank. And believe it or not, that is a very effective means of making the water even more attractive to the dust. But again, now you've got to limit that amount. You don't want to make a suds soapy water, and plus that's even more slippery. But it does increase. That requirement is actually written in the asbestos standard when they say use wet cutting methods, meaning dampen the asbestos. They actually require the use of a surfactant. Well, like we said, you can do anything you want if you're going to try to control the silica dust. So use, and for some reason, I guess any soap would work. A lot of people like Dawn dishwashing. In any event, these are some of the time tested excuses of why I can't do the right thing. And I get it. There's pros and cons and give and take and back and forth. I'm here to tell you the technology and the state of the industry has really overcome a lot of these. I mean, I literally had one guy to say, "Where am I going to get a tank of water?" They were working out on the highway. And I said, "You moron, just go down to the farm store, which is right at the next exit, and you can buy a tank for $70 that'll hold a couple of 100 gallons of water." I said, "That's all you need." He thought he would have to run a hose or start up a water company. I said, "That's bullshit. Just get the tank, run the hose. All you need is a couple of 5 gallon buckets, get it on the thing, and I don't want this dust on my project." And finally, we beat it through his skull that he did it. Using a generator to run a pump, to run a pressure washer. These are all the things you got to contend with. Here's an example. The generator runs, you got to have gasoline, which means now you got flammable liquid, you got to have a fire extinguisher, you got to have approved containers, you got to have anti-static, all that baggage. I said, "You moron, all you're doing with that generator is you're charging batteries for your cordless tools, or you're maybe running a pressure washer. Use the inverter that runs off the truck engine, so you've eliminated all the extra baggage. Not to mention, the generator creates a carbon footprint, and the engine on the vehicle is probably a lot less. So I bought a new Maverick. It's a hybrid. It's got the 110 outlet already installed. You don't even need an inverter. It's built in. So those are the kinds of advancements we want to see incrementally to get rid of, you swap one hazard for another headache. They're never all going to go away. However, this is what you need to be building into your program. And like we said, take a picture of it, document it, make it a bona fide part of your your whole program. Um, these are just some of the inconsequentials at the end of the day. The old tools, they ran out of brush. The motors weren't their brushes burn out, whatever. They throw the tool away. Now they got brushless motors, much more efficient. They don't overheat. You don't need a lot of baggage. Very much progression toward battery powered tools. You just keep your batteries charged. Some of the big tool guys, Milwaukee, fuel battery system, very reliable, very long longevity, good longevity. So those are some of the elements you want to pick up on. Electrical, housekeeping, a little bit of program maintenance. Never hesitate to put the name on your safety meeting topic as refresher training. You can do a refresher anytime along the way, document it. It keeps you in good graces with your program, your safety, your clients. So training, as we said, is the gold standard for the Department of Labor. They love, including on-the-job training. If you've got a defined program where you actually do OJT, it qualifies. Any type of training that's documented, recordable, reproducible. Oh, here's your last slide, bonus round. Safety program, any program out there, we're coming up on our time. Any program out there needs to have these three elements in some shape or form. If you want to relate them back to your Silica, that's fine. But program leadership contrasted with management. Most people focus on management, which is okay. There needs to be program leadership in your library. Employee engagement in the form of a safety committee. Trust me, that's one of the first questions OSHA is going to ask for. And show me some type of continuous improvement in your program so that we know you're doing better today, what you did okay yesterday. Program improvement, continuous improvement. That brings us to the end of the technical presentation. Brian, do you want to open it up for any questions? Brian Edmonds.
Thanks, John. It was one of the wonderful webinar. So, guys, we are open for the webinar questionnaire. If you want to ask any question, you can type your question in the chat box and wait for the answer to be announced.
What
Yeah,
do you think?
don't think there is any further question in the chat box. So, I would like to have you for the final remarks.
The final remarks is thank you for joining our webinar today. I encourage you to check the website for Prof's training because we're going to present these on a regular basis. I have a good time doing it. I think they cover the real world answers to many of these technical questions. We try to dispel the myths and the dragons that show up that create false impressions. People start jumping out of windows. How am I going to comply? Hold your breath. There's usually a very easy, simple methodology. We're here to help guide and show you the easy way to get in compliance. So thank you again for joining the group today.
Thanks, John. That does conclude the session for today. You may all disconnect now. You have a lovely day ahead. Bye bye. Take care.